Imagine standing in the shadow of a creature that defies everything you thought you knew about birds. Picture a towering beast, nearly 10 feet tall, with razor-sharp talons that could slice through bone, and a beak so massive it could crush a skull with a single snap. This isn't some Hollywood monster or mythical dragon. This was real. This walked the earth for millions of years, ruling entire continents with an iron grip. Welcome to the world of terror birds, the apex predators that turned the very concept of what a bird could be completely upside down. These weren't your typical feathered friends chirping in the backyard. These were evolutionary masterpieces of destruction, carnivorous giants that made even the fiercest mammals of their time think twice before venturing into the wrong territory. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about this story. The rise of terror birds wasn't just some random accident of evolution. It was the direct result of one of the most catastrophic events in Earth's history, an event that wiped out the dinosaurs and left massive ecological gaps begging to be filled. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating evolutionary stories ever told. We're going to uncover how a seemingly innocent group of birds transformed into the most feared predators on multiple continents. We'll explore their incredible diversity, from sleek hunters no bigger than a large dog to absolute behemoths that could look a horse in the eye. And we'll reveal the shocking truth about how these magnificent creatures ultimately met their end. This isn't just a story about ancient birds. This is a story about survival, adaptation, and the relentless drive of life to fill every possible niche on our planet. By the end of this series, you'll understand why terror birds represent one of evolution's most successful experiments, and why their legacy continues to influence the natural world today. But before we can appreciate the full scope of their dominance, we need to go back to where it all began, to a time when the world was rebuilding itself from the ashes of extinction. 66 million years ago, our planet experienced what scientists call the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction event. You probably know it better as the event that killed the dinosaurs. A massive asteroid slammed into Earth, triggering a cascade of environmental disasters that wiped out roughly 3/4 of all plant and animal species. The age of the dinosaurs was over, and the survivors were left to pick up the pieces in a dramatically altered world. Now, here's where most people get the story wrong. They think the dinosaurs went completely extinct, vanishing without a trace. But that's not what happened at all. The dinosaurs didn't disappear. They evolved, they adapted, they survived in the form of birds, carrying forward the genetic legacy of their massive ancestors into a new era. However, these early birds faced a massive problem. The ecological niches that had been dominated by large terrestrial dinosaurs were now empty. For millions of years, creatures like Tyrannosaurus rex and Allosaurus had ruled as the ultimate land predators. Suddenly, those roles were vacant, and nature abhors a vacuum. In most parts of the world, mammals quickly stepped up to fill these gaps. They grew larger, developed new hunting strategies, and gradually became the dominant predators we're familiar with today. But in certain isolated regions, something completely different happened. Birds, those living descendants of dinosaurs, decided they weren't content to remain small, flying creatures relegated to the margins of terrestrial ecosystems. The story begins on what might seem like an unlikely stage, the continent of Antarctica. Now, before you start picturing penguins and ice sheets, you need to understand that Antarctica, 60 million years ago, was nothing like the frozen wasteland we know today. This was a warm, lush continent covered in forests and teeming with life. The climate was so mild that palm trees grew near the South Pole. It was in this tropical Antarctic paradise that we find our first clues about the origins of terror birds. Fossil evidence suggests that some of the earliest members of what would become the terror bird lineage were living here during the Paleocene epoch. These weren't the massive predators we'll come to know later. They were relatively modest creatures, probably no larger than a medium-sized dog, but they possessed something special that would prove crucial for their descendants. These early Antarctic birds belonged to a group called Cariamiformes, and they had already begun to embrace a lifestyle that would define their lineage for millions of years to come. They were ground dwellers, spending most of their time walking rather than flying. More importantly, they had developed a taste for meat, supplementing the typical bird diet of seeds and insects with small vertebrates. To understand what these early terror bird ancestors might have looked like, we can examine their closest living relatives today, a group of South American birds called Seriemas. These modern birds give us a fascinating glimpse into the past. Seriemas are long-legged, ground-dwelling predators that hunt small animals across the grasslands of South America. They have powerful beaks, strong legs, and a primarily carnivorous diet. In many ways, they're like terror birds in miniature, evolutionary echoes of their magnificent extinct cousins. But here's where the story gets really interesting. While Antarctica may have been home to some early Cariamiformes, the fossil record suggests that the true birthplace of terror birds as we know them was actually South America. This makes perfect sense when you consider the unique circumstances the continent found itself in during the early Cenozoic era. South America, in the Paleocene and Eocene epochs, was essentially a giant island continent, completely isolated from North America and the rest of the world. This geographic isolation created what scientists call an evolutionary laboratory, a place where life could experiment with forms and strategies that would never have been possible in a more connected world. The mammalian fauna of South America during this time was unlike anything seen anywhere else on Earth. Instead of the familiar cats, dogs, and ungulates that were evolving in other parts of the world, South America was home to bizarre creatures that seem almost alien to our modern eyes. There were massive ground sloths, armored glyptodonts the size of cars, and strange hoofed mammals called notungulates that had no close relatives anywhere else on the planet. Into this weird and wonderful ecosystem stepped the terror birds, and they found themselves in the perfect position to seize control. Without competition from large mammalian predators like those evolving in other parts of the world, these birds had a clear evolutionary pathway to dominance. All they had to do was get bigger, stronger, and more efficient at killing. And that's exactly what they did. The fossil record from South America reveals an explosive radiation of terror bird species during the Eocene epoch, roughly 55 to 34 million years ago. These weren't just slight modifications of their ancestors. These were dramatic evolutionary leaps that transformed humble ground-dwelling birds into apex predators, capable of taking down prey many times their own size. The earliest confirmed terror bird from South America dates back to the early Eocene period in Brazil. This species, while still relatively modest compared to later giants, already showed the key characteristics that would define the entire group. It had a massive, hooked beak designed for tearing flesh, powerful legs built for running down prey, and reduced flight capabilities that allowed it to invest more energy into terrestrial hunting. But this was just the beginning. Over the following millions of years, terror birds would diversify into an incredible array of forms, each adapted to specific ecological niches and hunting strategies. Some would remain relatively small and agile, perfect for chasing down small mammals and reptiles through dense forest undergrowth. Others would grow to truly monstrous proportions, becoming walking nightmares, capable of taking down prey as large as early horses. The key to understanding terror bird evolution lies in recognizing that they weren't just random experiments in avian gigantism. Each species was a finely tuned predatory machine, perfectly adapted to exploit specific opportunities in their environment. Their beaks weren't just large for the sake of being impressive. They were precision instruments, capable of delivering devastating strikes with surgical accuracy. The biomechanics of terror bird predation were truly remarkable. Their long, flexible necks allowed them to strike with incredible force and precision, while their powerful leg muscles provided the strength needed to pin down struggling prey. Some species likely used their beaks like pickaxes, delivering crushing blows that could shatter bones and cause massive internal trauma. Others may have employed a more surgical approach, using their razor-sharp beak edges to slice through vital arteries and organs. What made terror birds particularly formidable was their combination of size, speed, and intelligence. These weren't mindless killing machines. They were sophisticated predators with complex hunting strategies and social behaviors. Some species likely hunted in coordinated groups, using teamwork to bring down prey that would have been impossible for a single individual to handle. The diversity of terror bird species during their heyday was truly staggering. Paleontologists have identified dozens of different species, ranging from graceful, swift hunters to massive, heavily built ambush predators. Each had evolved specific adaptations for their particular ecological niche, creating a complex web of predatory relationships that dominated South American ecosystems for millions of years. Some terror birds specialized in hunting in dense forests, using their agility and stealth to surprise prey in cluttered environments. Others were built for pursuit, hunting across open plains, using their incredible running speed to chase down fast-moving mammals. Still others were massive, intimidating creatures that likely relied on their sheer size and power to overawe potential prey and competitors. The success of terror birds in South America was so complete that they essentially replaced large mammalian predators entirely. While other continents saw the rise of early cats, dogs, and other carnivorous mammals, South America remained firmly under avian control. This created one of the most unique predator-prey dynamics in Earth's history, with giant flightless birds occupying the ecological roles that mammals filled everywhere else. But terror birds weren't content to remain confined to South America forever. As we'll explore in the next part of our series, these magnificent predators would eventually break free from their island continent and spread their influence across multiple continents, bringing their unique brand of avian terror to ecosystems that had never experienced anything quite like them. The stage was set for one of the most remarkable episodes in evolutionary history. Terror birds had perfected their deadly craft in the isolation of South America, and they were about to show the world what millions of years of evolution could produce when birds decided to reclaim their dinosaurian heritage as the ultimate terrestrial predators. The evolutionary journey of terror birds wasn't just a simple story of getting bigger and meaner. It was a masterclass in adaptive radiation, where a single ancestral lineage exploded into dozens of specialized forms, each perfectly crafted for their particular slice of the predatory landscape. What we're about to explore is nothing short of evolutionary genius in action. Picture this scenario. You've got an entire continent essentially serving as a massive evolutionary playground, isolated from outside interference for millions of years. South America during the Paleogene period was like a giant laboratory where nature could experiment with the most outrageous designs imaginable. And at the center of it all were these incredible birds, pushing the boundaries of what avian predators could become. The diversification that followed was absolutely mind-blowing. We're not talking about minor tweaks here and there. We're talking about fundamental redesigns of the basic terror bird blueprint, creating creatures so specialized that they occupied completely different ecological roles while still maintaining their core identity as apex avian predators. Let's start with what paleontologists like to call the light terror birds. Now, don't let that name fool you into thinking these were somehow less impressive than their larger cousins. These were sleek, agile hunters that represented the pinnacle of predatory efficiency in their size class. Think of them as the cheetahs of the terror bird world, built for speed, precision, and deadly effectiveness. Take a creature like Kariyama, for example. This remarkable predator stood just over 2.5 feet tall and weighed around 18 pounds. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the size of a large turkey, but with the attitude and equipment of a professional assassin. These birds were living proof that you don't need to be massive to be absolutely terrifying. The anatomy of these lighter terror birds was a masterpiece of predatory design. Their legs were long and powerful, built for explosive acceleration and sustained pursuit. Their necks were elongated and incredibly flexible, allowing them to strike with lightning speed and surgical precision. But it was their beaks that truly set them apart from anything else in the animal kingdom. These weren't just oversized bird beaks. These were specialized killing instruments, perfectly evolved for their particular hunting style. The beak of a light terror bird was like a living dagger, sharp enough to pierce hide and muscle, strong enough to crush bone, and precisely controlled enough to target vital organs with deadly accuracy. But here's what makes the story even more fascinating. These smaller terror birds weren't just scaled-down versions of their larger relatives. They had evolved completely different hunting strategies and ecological roles. While the giants we'll discuss later were built for taking down large prey through brute force, these lighter species were masters of stealth and precision. Evidence suggests that many of these smaller terror birds were forest dwellers, using the dense vegetation as cover while they stalked their prey. They were probably incredibly intelligent hunters, capable of complex problem-solving and strategic thinking. Some may have even used tools or cooperative hunting techniques, though the fossil record makes it difficult to confirm these behaviors directly. The success of these lighter terror birds was phenomenal. They spread throughout South America, adapting to every conceivable habitat and ecological niche. Some specialized in hunting small mammals, others focused on reptiles, and still others may have been opportunistic scavengers, cleaning up the leftovers from their larger cousins' kills. But while these smaller species were perfecting the art of precision predation, other terror bird lineages were heading in a completely different direction. They were embracing the philosophy that bigger is indeed better, and the results were absolutely spectacular. Enter the true terror birds, the giants that would become the stuff of nightmares for every other creature sharing their ecosystem. These weren't just large birds. These were evolutionary statements, declarations that avian predators could rival or exceed anything the mammalian world had to offer. The largest of these magnificent beasts reached truly staggering proportions. We're talking about birds that stood over 9 feet tall and weighed more than 800 pounds. To put that in perspective, these creatures were taller than most professional basketball players and heavier than a fully grown grizzly bear. And unlike bears, which are omnivores with a relatively gentle disposition when not threatened, these giants were pure, concentrated predatory fury. The most famous of these colossal terror birds was a creature that roamed the Argentine plains during the Miocene epoch. This absolute unit of a predator represented the pinnacle of terror bird evolution, a creature so perfectly adapted to its role as an apex predator that it dominated its ecosystem for millions of years. The sheer physical presence of this giant would have been overwhelming. Its massive skull alone was larger than that of most big cats, housing a brain sophisticated enough to coordinate complex hunting behaviors and a beak powerful enough to crush the skull of a horse-sized mammal. Its legs were like tree trunks, packed with muscle and designed to deliver devastating kicks that could shatter ribs or break spines. But size alone doesn't make a successful predator. What made these giant terror birds truly formidable was how perfectly every aspect of their anatomy was integrated into a unified killing machine. Their necks were incredibly strong and flexible, allowing them to deliver precise strikes with enormous force. Their feet were equipped with massive talons that could pin down struggling prey, while their beak finished the job. The hunting strategy of these giants was probably quite different from their smaller relatives. Rather than relying on stealth and precision, they likely used intimidation and overwhelming force. Picture one of these massive birds emerging from the forest edge. Its presence alone enough to scatter most potential prey animals. For those unlucky enough to be caught in the open, escape would have been nearly impossible. These giants weren't just random monsters, though. They were the product of millions of years of evolutionary refinement, each generation becoming more perfectly adapted to their role as South America's dominant predators. The fossil record shows a clear progression toward larger size and more specialized anatomy, suggesting that there was strong selective pressure favoring these traits. Interestingly, not all paleontologists agree on whether some of the largest specimens should even be classified as true terror birds. There's ongoing debate about certain massive fossils, with some researchers suggesting they might represent a completely different lineage of giant birds that converged on a similar body plan. This controversy highlights just how diverse and complex the world of ancient avian predators really was. The existence of these giants raises fascinating questions about the ecosystems they inhabited. What kind of prey base could support predators of this size? How did they interact with other large animals in their environment? The answers paint a picture of South America during the Miocene as one of the most dynamic and dangerous ecosystems in Earth's history. The prey animals available to these giant terror birds were themselves quite impressive. South America during this period was home to massive ground sloths, enormous armadillos, and primitive horses and camels. These weren't easy targets by any means, but the terror birds had evolved exactly the right combination of size, strength, and hunting ability to take them down. Some of the most intriguing fossils show evidence of interactions between terror birds and their prey. Bite marks on bones, crushed skulls, and other signs of predation tell the story of epic battles between some of the most formidable creatures ever to walk the earth. These weren't simple predator-prey relationships. These were evolutionary arms races, with each side constantly adapting to counter the other's advantages. But the story of terror bird diversity doesn't end with just small hunters and giant killers. The fossil record reveals an incredible spectrum of intermediate forms, each adapted to specific ecological niches and hunting strategies. There were medium-sized species that specialized in particular types of prey, others that adapted to specific habitats, and still others that developed unique anatomical features for specialized hunting techniques. Some terror birds evolved incredibly long legs for pursuit hunting across open plains. Others developed particularly robust skulls and necks for dealing with heavily armored prey. Still others may have been semi-aquatic, hunting along riverbanks and wetlands for fish, amphibians, and water birds. This incredible diversity wasn't just limited to South America either. As we'll explore later, terror birds eventually managed to break free from their island continent and establish populations in other parts of the world. But wherever they went, they brought with them the same fundamental approach to predation that had made them so successful in their homeland. The evolutionary success of terror birds during their heyday was truly remarkable. For over 20 million years, they dominated the predatory landscape of an entire continent adapting to every conceivable ecological niche and evolving solutions to every challenge their environment threw at them. They were living proof that birds, given the right circumstances, could reclaim their dinosaurian heritage as the ultimate terrestrial predators. But even the most successful evolutionary experiments eventually face challenges that test their limits. As we'll discover in the next part of our exploration, the world was changing in ways that would ultimately challenge the supremacy of these magnificent predators. New continents were connecting, new competitors were arriving, and the climate itself was beginning to shift in ways that would reshape the entire planet. The stage was being set for the next chapter in the terror bird saga, one that would see these incredible creatures face their greatest challenges and ultimately their most significant test of evolutionary fitness. But before we get to that dramatic conclusion, we need to understand just how far these amazing birds managed to spread their influence beyond their South American homeland. The terror birds weren't content to remain forever confined to their South American fortress. As the epochs rolled by and the continents themselves began to shift, these magnificent predators would embark on one of the most ambitious expansions in evolutionary history. What happened next would test everything they had learned during their millions of years of dominance. But before we dive into their great migration, we need to address something that's been lurking in the background of our story. The terror birds weren't the only giant flightless predatory birds stalking the earth during the Cenozoic era. In fact, the world was absolutely crawling with massive avian killers, and some of them were even more terrifying than our South American champions. Picture this scenario playing out across multiple continents simultaneously. While terror birds were perfecting their craft in South America, similar evolutionary pressures were creating comparable monsters in completely different parts of the world. It's like nature was conducting a massive experiment, testing whether birds could successfully reclaim their dinosaurian legacy as apex predators on a global scale. In Europe, Asia, and North America, a group of giants called gastornithids were writing their own chapter in the book of avian terror. These creatures were absolutely massive, with some species reaching heights of nearly 7 feet and weights approaching 400 pounds. They possessed the same basic blueprint as terror birds: massive beaks, powerful legs, and a completely terrestrial lifestyle. But they had evolved these features independently. The most famous of these northern giants was a creature that dominated the landscape from the late Paleocene through the Eocene epochs. This formidable predator stalked the forests and plains of what would become modern-day Europe and North America, using its enormous size and devastating beak to secure its position at the top of the food chain. But here's where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit disappointing if you're rooting for maximum carnage. Recent research suggests that these fearsome-looking northern giants may not have been the bloodthirsty killers they appeared to be. Evidence is mounting that many of these species were actually herbivorous, using their massive beaks not to crush the skulls of hapless mammals, but to crack open fruits, nuts, and seeds. Can you imagine the psychological impact this discovery has had on paleontologists who spent years fantasizing about epic battles between giant predatory birds and early mammals? Here, they thought they had uncovered evidence of some of the most terrifying predators in Earth's history, only to find out these monsters were essentially oversized vegetarians, munching their way through prehistoric salad bars. This revelation puts the true terror birds of South America in an even more impressive light. While their northern cousins were content to embrace a peaceful, herbivorous lifestyle, the South American species remained committed to their carnivorous calling. They were the real deal, the genuine article, the authentic heirs to the predatory legacy of their dinosaurian ancestors. But the gastornithids weren't the only imposters in the giant bird game. Down in Australia, another group of massive flightless birds was making its own bid for evolutionary stardom. These creatures, nicknamed the demon ducks, were even larger than both the terror birds and the gastornithids, with some species reaching truly astronomical weights of over 1,800 pounds. At that size, these Australian giants were among the largest birds ever to walk the earth, rivaled only by the legendary elephant birds of Madagascar. The sheer thought of encountering one of these behemoths in the wild is enough to make your blood run cold. A creature that massive, moving with predatory intent, would have been the stuff of absolute nightmares. But once again, reality has a way of deflating our most exciting fantasies. Just like their northern relatives, these Australian giants appear to have been predominantly herbivorous. Their anatomy tells a story of creatures adapted for processing plant material rather than tearing flesh. Their claws were more like hooves. Their beaks lacked the sharp predatory points we see in true terror birds. And their overall build suggested a lifestyle more focused on browsing than hunting. This pattern of convergent evolution toward giant herbivorous birds on multiple continents raises fascinating questions about the ecological pressures and opportunities that existed during the Cenozoic era. It seems that in many parts of the world, the post-extinction environment favored the evolution of large ground-dwelling birds, but only in South America did these birds maintain their commitment to a predatory lifestyle. What made South America different? Why did terror birds remain dedicated carnivores, while their counterparts elsewhere abandoned the hunt for a more peaceful existence? The answer lies in the unique ecological circumstances that shaped the South American continent during this crucial period in Earth's history. South America's isolation created a perfect storm of conditions that not only allowed terror birds to thrive as predators, but actually required them to maintain their carnivorous lifestyle. The mammalian fauna of South America was so bizarre and so different from anywhere else on Earth that conventional predatory strategies simply wouldn't work. Terror birds had to innovate, adapt, and perfect their hunting techniques in ways that their counterparts on other continents never needed to. The prey animals available to South American terror birds were unlike anything found elsewhere. Massive, heavily armored creatures that required specialized techniques to bring down. Swift, agile mammals that demanded incredible speed and precision to catch. Bizarre, never-before-seen forms that challenged every assumption about predator-prey relationships. This constant pressure to adapt and improve kept terror birds sharp, kept them evolving, kept them pushing the boundaries of what avian predators could accomplish. While birds on other continents were settling into comfortable herbivorous niches, South American terror birds were engaged in an ongoing evolutionary arms race that would ultimately produce some of the most sophisticated predators in Earth's history. But isolation, as we all know, can't last forever. The geological forces that had kept South America separate from the rest of the world were slowly but inexorably working to reconnect the continents. And when that connection finally occurred, it would set the stage for one of the most dramatic ecological upheavals in the history of life on Earth. The Great American Biotic Interchange, as scientists call it, began roughly 15 million years ago, when volcanic activity started building a land bridge between North and South America. This process would take millions of years to complete, but its effects would be felt long before the continents were fully connected. As the gap between the continents narrowed, occasional island chains and temporary land bridges allowed small numbers of animals to make the journey between North and South America. These early pioneers were the advance scouts of what would eventually become a massive biological invasion in both directions. For the terror birds, this represented both an incredible opportunity and a potentially existential threat. On one hand, the opening of new territories offered the chance to expand their range and establish populations in completely new ecosystems. Some terror bird species would indeed make this journey, becoming the first of their kind to set foot on North American soil in tens of millions of years. But the connection also meant that South America's unique ecosystem would be exposed to competition from North American predators for the first time in geological ages. Cats, dogs, bears, and other mammalian carnivores that had been perfecting their own hunting techniques in the competitive environment of North America were about to encounter the isolated world of South American terror birds. The first terror birds to make the journey north were like evolutionary ambassadors, carrying with them millions of years of South American innovation in avian predation. These pioneers had to adapt quickly to completely new environments, new prey species, and new competitive pressures. The fact that they succeeded at all is a testament to the fundamental soundness of the terror bird design. One of the most successful of these northern pioneers was a species that managed to establish thriving populations across much of what is now the southern United States. Fossil evidence shows that these birds successfully colonized territories from Texas to Florida, adapting to everything from coastal wetlands to inland prairies. What's particularly remarkable about this northern expansion is that it occurred while terror birds were still at the height of their success in South America. This wasn't a desperate migration by a failing lineage. This was a confident expansion by creatures at the peak of their evolutionary game, testing their abilities against new challenges and new opportunities. The terror birds that made this journey had to be incredibly adaptable. The climate in North America was different from what they were used to. The prey animals were unfamiliar. The vegetation was strange. The seasonal patterns were unlike anything in their ancestral memory. Yet they not only survived, but thrived, establishing populations that would persist for millions of years. But success in North America came with its own set of challenges. The terror birds were no longer the undisputed apex predators they had been in South America. They now had to share their ecological niche with mammalian carnivores that were every bit as sophisticated and deadly as they were. The fossil record from this period tells a fascinating story of coexistence and competition. Rather than immediately driving each other to extinction, terror birds and mammalian predators seem to have carved out complementary niches, each exploiting slightly different prey bases and hunting strategies. This suggests a level of ecological sophistication that goes far beyond simple brute force competition. Some terror birds may have specialized in hunting prey that was difficult for mammalian predators to catch. Others might have focused on scavenging opportunities that their competitors couldn't exploit. Still others may have developed cooperative relationships with other species, forming complex ecological networks that benefited all participants. The ability of terror birds to not just survive, but actually thrive in this competitive environment speaks volumes about their evolutionary sophistication. These weren't primitive throwbacks struggling to compete with more advanced mammals. These were highly evolved predators, holding their own against some of the most successful carnivores in Earth's history. Meanwhile, back in South America, the terror bird homeland was experiencing its own dramatic changes. The arrival of North American mammals was reshaping ecosystems that had remained essentially unchanged for millions of years. Some terror bird species found themselves facing competition they had never encountered before. Others discovered new opportunities created by the disruption of established ecological relationships. The result was a period of incredible evolutionary experimentation and adaptation. Some terror bird lineages doubled down on their traditional strategies, becoming even more specialized and efficient at what they had always done best. Others embraced change, developing new hunting techniques and exploring previously unexploited ecological niches. This period of upheaval also saw the emergence of some of the largest and most impressive terror birds in the lineage's history. As if responding to the challenge posed by incoming mammalian competitors, some species pushed the boundaries of size and power even further, becoming truly colossal predators that dwarfed anything that had come before. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of evolutionary experiments, each more remarkable than the last. There were terror birds adapted for pursuit hunting across open plains, others built for ambush predation in dense forests, and still others that seemed to be testing entirely new approaches to avian carnivory. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this period is what it reveals about the fundamental nature of terror bird evolution. Rather than being rigid specialists locked into unchanging patterns of behavior, these creatures demonstrated remarkable flexibility and adaptability. They were evolutionary generalists, in the best sense of the term, capable of rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. while maintaining their core identity as apex avian predators. This adaptability would prove crucial as the world continued to change around them. The Great American Biotic Interchange was just the beginning of a series of environmental challenges that would test every aspect of terror bird biology and behavior. Climate patterns were shifting, sea levels were changing, and the entire planet was beginning to transition toward the cooler, more variable conditions that would characterize the later Cenozoic era. The terror birds had survived the extinction of the dinosaurs, thrived during the warm greenhouse conditions of the early Cenozoic, adapted to the changing geography of their homeland, and successfully expanded into new territories. They had proven themselves to be one of the most successful and adaptable lineages in the history of life on Earth. But their greatest test was yet to come. The very climate that had allowed them to flourish for so many millions of years was about to change in ways that would challenge every aspect of their evolutionary strategy. The warm, stable conditions that had characterized much of the Cenozoic were giving way to a new era of cooling temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and increasing environmental instability. How would these magnificent predators, so perfectly adapted to their warm tropical world, respond to a planet that was becoming cooler, drier, and more unpredictable? The answer to that question would determine whether the terror birds would continue their remarkable evolutionary journey or join the countless other lineages that had risen to greatness only to fall victim to changing circumstances beyond their control. The answer to that question would prove to be one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the entire history of life on Earth. But before we get to that tragic conclusion, we need to explore one of the most persistent myths about terror bird extinction, a theory that sounds perfectly logical, but turns out to be completely wrong. For decades, scientists believed they had the perfect explanation for why terror birds disappeared. It was a classic story of ecological competition, the kind of narrative that makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. The theory went like this. When the Isthmus of Panama finally formed a complete land bridge between North and South America around 3 million years ago, it unleashed a flood of advanced mammalian predators into South America. These sophisticated hunters, the story claimed, simply outcompeted the terror birds for resources and drove them to extinction. It's an appealing explanation, isn't it? The idea that more advanced mammals swept in and overwhelmed these ancient avian relics fits perfectly with our preconceptions about evolutionary progress. We like to think of evolution as a steady march toward more sophisticated forms, with newer lineages inevitably replacing older ones. The terror birds in this narrative were evolutionary dinosaurs in the most literal sense, magnificent but ultimately doomed throwbacks to an earlier age. But here's the problem with appealing explanations. They're often wrong, and in the case of terror bird extinction, the competitive exclusion theory falls apart the moment you examine the actual fossil evidence. What the fossils tell us is a completely different story, one that's far more complex and ultimately far more tragic. Let's start with the most obvious problem with the competition theory. If mammalian predators were systematically driving terror birds to extinction, we should see clear evidence of this in the fossil record. We should find layers where terror birds disappear at exactly the same time that mammalian carnivores appear. We should see signs of declining terror bird populations coinciding with increasing mammalian diversity. But that's not what we find at all. Instead, the fossil record shows something much more surprising. Terror birds and mammalian predators weren't locked in some epic battle for supremacy. They were coexisting quite peacefully. Thank you very much. In many locations, we find fossils of both groups living side by side for millions of years, with no signs of competitive stress. Take the case of one of the most successful North American terror birds. This remarkable species managed to establish thriving populations across a huge range, from the Gulf Coast of Texas all the way to the Atlantic shores of Florida. And guess what else was living in those exact same areas at the exact same time? A diverse community of mammalian predators, including some of the most formidable carnivores of their era. If the competition theory were correct, we should see evidence of intense ecological pressure, declining population sizes, or geographic range restrictions. Instead, we see the opposite. Both terror birds and mammalian predators appear to have been thriving, each exploiting slightly different aspects of the same general ecosystem. This pattern of coexistence rather than competition appears throughout the fossil record. In location after location, time period after time period, we find evidence that terror birds were perfectly capable of holding their own against mammalian competition. They weren't being systematically outcompeted. They weren't losing ground to superior predators. They were adapting, evolving, and continuing to succeed in their ecological roles. Some researchers have suggested that this coexistence was possible because terror birds and mammalian predators were exploiting different prey bases or using different hunting strategies. Terror birds, with their incredible running speed and powerful beaks, may have specialized in prey that was difficult for mammalian predators to catch. Mammals, with their diverse array of hunting techniques, may have focused on opportunities that were less suitable for avian predators. This kind of ecological partitioning is actually quite common in nature. When two groups of predators share the same general habitat, they often evolve complementary strategies that allow them to coexist without directly competing. The result is often a richer, more diverse ecosystem that supports a wider variety of species than would be possible with just one type of predator. But if competition with mammals wasn't driving terror birds to extinction, what was? Some researchers have proposed an even more dramatic explanation: human hunting pressure. According to this theory, the arrival of human hunters in the Americas was the final nail in the terror bird coffin. These new predators, armed with sophisticated weapons and cooperative hunting strategies, systematically hunted terror birds to extinction. It's another appealing story, and one that fits with our growing understanding of human impact on prehistoric ecosystems. We know that human arrival in many parts of the world coincided with mass extinctions of large animals, a pattern that's been documented on every continent humans have colonized. The idea that terror birds fell victim to this same process seems perfectly reasonable. But once again, the timing doesn't work out. The fossil evidence is absolutely clear on this point. Terror birds were disappearing long before humans ever set foot in the Americas. The last confirmed terror bird fossils date to around 100,000 years ago, while the earliest evidence of human presence in the Americas is less than 20,000 years old. That's a gap of at least 80,000 years. Far too long to blame human hunting for terror bird extinction. Even the latest surviving terror bird species, which managed to persist longer than any of their relatives, went extinct tens of thousands of years before the first human hunters arrived in their territory. The timing simply doesn't match up, no matter how you try to make it work. So, if it wasn't competition with mammals, and it wasn't human hunting pressure, what actually killed off these magnificent predators? The answer, frustratingly enough, is probably the most boring explanation possible. Climate change. Not the rapid human-caused climate change we're dealing with today, but the slow, inexorable shift toward cooler, drier conditions that characterized the later Cenozoic era. I know, climate change as an explanation for prehistoric extinctions has become something of a scientific cliché. It's the explanation scientists fall back on when they can't find evidence for more dramatic causes. But in the case of terror birds, the climate change explanation isn't just a default option. It's actually supported by a wealth of evidence that paints a clear picture of how changing environmental conditions gradually undermine the very foundations of terror bird success. Remember, terror birds had evolved during the warm, humid conditions of the early Cenozoic era. Their entire evolutionary strategy was built around exploiting the opportunities provided by tropical and subtropical ecosystems. They were creatures of warm climates, adapted for life in environments that remained relatively stable throughout the year. But starting in the Miocene epoch and accelerating through the Pliocene and Pleistocene, global climate patterns began to shift dramatically. Temperatures dropped, rainfall patterns changed, and many regions that had been warm and humid for millions of years became cooler and drier. The lush forests and grasslands that had supported terror bird populations began to give way to more arid environments that were less suitable for large predators. This climate shift wasn't a sudden catastrophe. It was a gradual process that played out over millions of years, which makes it particularly insidious from an evolutionary perspective. Species that might have been able to adapt to rapid, dramatic change found themselves gradually squeezed by slowly shifting conditions that never quite triggered the kind of adaptive response that might have saved them. The effects of this climate change weren't uniform across all terror bird populations. Species living in the most tropical regions, where conditions remained relatively stable, managed to persist much longer than those in more marginal areas. The last surviving terror birds were concentrated in the warmest, most humid parts of their former range, clinging to the environmental conditions that had allowed their lineage to flourish for so many millions of years. Lord. But even these final holdouts couldn't escape the inexorable march of climate change. As temperatures continued to drop and rainfall patterns became increasingly erratic, even the most stable tropical refuges began to fragment and disappear. The ecosystems that had supported terror birds for over 20 million years were simply vanishing, replaced by environments that were fundamentally unsuitable for large avian predators. The fossil record from this period tells a story of gradual decline rather than sudden collapse. Terror bird populations didn't crash overnight. Instead, they slowly dwindled as environmental conditions became increasingly challenging. Species ranges contracted, population sizes decreased, and genetic diversity was gradually lost as isolated populations became too small to maintain themselves over the long term. This pattern of gradual decline makes perfect sense when you consider the specialized nature of terror bird ecology. These weren't generalist predators capable of adapting to a wide range of environmental conditions. They were highly specialized creatures that had evolved very specific adaptations for very specific ecological niches. When those niches began to disappear, the terror birds had few options for adaptation. The tragedy of terror bird extinction becomes even more poignant when you consider how successful they had been at adapting to other challenges throughout their evolutionary history. These were creatures that had survived the aftermath of the asteroid impact that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. They had thrived during the great American biotic interchange. They had successfully expanded into new continents and established populations in completely unfamiliar environments. But climate change was different from these other challenges. It wasn't a discrete event that could be survived through superior adaptations or lucky circumstances. It was a fundamental alteration of the environmental conditions that had shaped terror bird evolution from the very beginning. No amount of evolutionary sophistication could overcome the simple fact that the world was becoming unsuitable for creatures adapted to a completely different set of environmental conditions. The last terror birds probably lived lives of increasing desperation, confined to shrinking patches of suitable habitat in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to their way of life. They may have been forced to compete more intensively for dwindling resources or to attempt hunting strategies they were poorly equipped for. Some may have tried to adapt to the changing conditions, but by then it was too late. The window of opportunity for major evolutionary adaptation had closed. Even more heartbreaking is the realization that terror birds came tantalizingly close to surviving into the modern era. The last confirmed terror bird fossils date to around 100,000 years ago, which in geological terms is practically yesterday. If climate conditions had remained stable for just a little bit longer, or if the cooling trend had been slightly less severe, we might still have terror birds stalking the grasslands of South America today. Can you imagine what that world would look like? Picture modern Argentina or Brazil with populations of giant predatory birds still maintaining their ancient ecological roles. Imagine the impact this would have had on human settlement of the Americas or on the development of South American ecosystems. The presence of living terror birds would have fundamentally altered the entire course of natural history in the Western Hemisphere. But that's not the world we live in. Instead, we're left with fossils and reconstructions, trying to piece together the story of these remarkable creatures from fragments of bone and educated guesswork. The terror birds are gone, victims not of superior competitors or human persecution, but of the simple, inexorable process of environmental change. The extinction of terror birds represents one of the great losses in the history of life on Earth. These weren't just another group of prehistoric animals that happened to go extinct. They were evolutionary masterpieces, the culmination of millions of years of refinement and adaptation. They represented a completely unique solution to the challenge of terrestrial predation, one that we'll never see again. Their loss also represents a broader tragedy about the nature of evolution and extinction. The terror birds did everything right from an evolutionary perspective. They adapted successfully to their environment, diversified into multiple ecological niches, survived numerous challenges, and maintained their success for over 20 million years. But in the end, none of that mattered when the fundamental conditions that had shaped their evolution began to change. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson we can learn from the terror bird story. Evolution is not a guarantee of survival. Adaptation is not a shield against extinction. Even the most successful lineages can be brought low by forces beyond their control. The terror birds were magnificent, but magnificence alone was not enough to save them from a changing world. As we conclude this exploration of terror bird evolution, it's worth reflecting on what their story tells us about the nature of life itself. Evolution is not a ladder leading inevitably toward greater complexity and sophistication. It's more like a vast experiment, with countless different approaches being tested simultaneously. Most of these experiments eventually fail, not because they're inferior, but simply because the conditions that allowed them to succeed inevitably change. The terror birds were one of evolution's most spectacular successes, but they were also a reminder that success in the natural world is always temporary. They had their moment in the sun, and what a moment it was. For over 20 million years, they ruled as apex predators across multiple continents, pushing the boundaries of what avian evolution could accomplish and creating some of the most remarkable predators in Earth's history. Their legacy lives on not just in the fossil record, but in their living descendants. The Seriamas of South America carry forward a genetic inheritance that stretches back to the earliest terror birds. These modest ground-dwelling predators are living links to one of the most extraordinary chapters in evolutionary history. When you see a Seriama stalking through the grasslands of Argentina, you're witnessing an echo of the terror birds that once dominated those same landscapes. The story of terror bird evolution is ultimately a story about the incredible creativity and resilience of life itself. When the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct, life didn't simply give up on the idea of large terrestrial predators. Instead, it found a new way to fill that ecological role, transforming humble ground-dwelling birds into some of the most formidable hunters the world has ever seen. That transformation required millions of years of patient evolutionary work, countless generations of gradual refinement, and the precise coordination of anatomical, physiological, and behavioral adaptations. The result was a group of creatures so perfectly suited to their role that they dominated their ecosystems for geological ages. But perhaps the most important lesson from the terror bird story is that even the most remarkable evolutionary achievements are ultimately temporary. The conditions that allow any particular group of organisms to flourish will eventually change. And when they do, even the most successful lineages may find themselves unable to adapt quickly enough to survive. This doesn't diminish the wonder of what terror birds accomplished during their time on Earth. If anything, it makes their achievements even more remarkable. They represent a brief, shining moment when evolution produced something truly extraordinary, a group of creatures that redefined what it meant to be a predatory bird and left an indelible mark on the history of life. The terror birds are gone, but their story continues to inspire and educate us. They remind us that evolution is capable of producing solutions to ecological challenges that we would never have imagined possible. They show us that success in nature comes in many different forms, and that there's no single pathway to evolutionary achievement. Most importantly, they demonstrate that every species, no matter how successful or well adapted, exists within a larger context of environmental conditions that are constantly changing. The challenge for all life is not just to adapt to current conditions, but to maintain the flexibility necessary to respond to whatever changes the future might bring. In that sense, the terror birds were both a spectacular success and a cautionary tale. They succeeded brilliantly at adapting to the world they knew, but they were ultimately unable to adapt to the world that was coming. Their story is a reminder that in the grand theater of evolution, every species is both actor and audience, playing their part in an ongoing drama whose ending no one can predict. The curtain has fallen on the terror birds, but the show goes on. Somewhere out there, new evolutionary experiments are being conducted, new adaptations are being tested, and new stories of success and failure are being written. The terror birds had their moment, and it was magnificent. Now it's time for other species to take the stage and show us what evolution can accomplish next. And yet, even as we mourn the loss of these magnificent creatures, there's something else we need to consider. The terror birds weren't the only giants stalking the ancient world during their reign. In fact, the Cenozoic era was absolutely crawling with massive, fearsome-looking birds that bore striking resemblances to our South American champions. But here's where things get really interesting and, frankly, a bit complicated. While terror birds were perfecting their deadly craft in the isolation of South America, similar evolutionary pressures were creating what appeared to be comparable monsters on other continents. It's as if nature was running multiple experiments simultaneously, testing whether giant predatory birds could succeed on a global scale. The results of these experiments would prove to be both fascinating and deeply ironic. Let's start with Europe, Asia, and North America, where a group of absolute behemoths called gastornithids were making their own bid for apex predator status. These creatures were genuinely terrifying to behold, standing nearly 7 feet tall and weighing close to 400 pounds. They possessed the same basic template that made terror birds so successful: massive, powerful beaks, incredibly strong legs, and a completely terrestrial lifestyle that abandoned flight for ground-based dominance. The most famous of these northern giants dominated the landscape from the late Paleocene through the Eocene epochs, roughly 55 to 35 million years ago. This formidable creature stalked the forests and plains of what would become modern Europe and North America. Its massive frame casting shadows that would have sent shivers down the spine of any mammal unlucky enough to cross its path. For decades, paleontologists assumed these giants were the northern equivalent of South American terror birds. The anatomy seemed perfect for a predatory lifestyle. The massive skull could house a brain sophisticated enough for complex hunting behaviors. The enormous beak appeared perfectly designed for crushing bones and tearing flesh. The powerful legs looked built for pursuit hunting and delivering devastating kicks to struggling prey. But science has a way of humbling our most dramatic assumptions, and the gastornithids would prove to be one of paleontology's most surprising revelations. Advanced biomechanical analysis and detailed study of their anatomy has revealed something that completely overturns our understanding of these apparent monsters. These fearsome-looking giants, despite their intimidating appearance, were actually gentle herbivores. Yes, you heard that correctly. These massive, terrifying-looking birds with their enormous beaks and powerful builds were essentially prehistoric vegetarians, using their impressive equipment not to crush the skulls of helpless mammals, but to crack open tough fruits, nuts, and seeds. It's like discovering that your neighborhood's most intimidating bouncer actually spends his evenings knitting sweaters and tending to his garden. The evidence for this herbivorous lifestyle is actually quite compelling when you know what to look for. The shape of their beaks, while massive and impressive, lacks the sharp, pointed tips we see in dedicated carnivores. Instead, they're broader and more robust, perfect for applying crushing force to hard plant materials. Their leg bones, while powerful, don't show the same adaptations for delivering precise, devastating kicks that we see in true terror birds. Even more telling is the microscopic analysis of their teeth and jaw muscles, which reveals adaptations perfectly suited for processing tough plant material rather than tearing flesh. These weren't killing machines at all. They were essentially giant feathered lawnmowers perfectly adapted for exploiting the abundant plant resources of their warm, humid world. This revelation puts the South American terror birds in an even more remarkable light. While their northern cousins were content to embrace a peaceful, herbivorous existence, the terror birds remained absolutely committed to their carnivorous calling. They were the real deal, the genuine inheritors of the predatory legacy left vacant by the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. But the gastornithids weren't the only case of mistaken identity in the giant bird world. Down in Australia, an even more impressive group of creatures was making its own evolutionary statement. These beasts, colloquially known as the demon ducks, were pushing the boundaries of avian size to truly astronomical proportions. Some of these Australian giants reached weights of over 1,800 pounds, making them among the largest birds ever to walk the earth. Only the legendary elephant birds of Madagascar could claim to be larger. The sheer physical presence of these creatures would have been overwhelming. Picture something the size of a small car, covered in feathers, moving with the fluid grace that only birds can achieve. At first glance, these demon ducks seemed like they would make terror birds look like harmless songbirds by comparison. Their massive size suggested predatory capabilities that would dwarf anything South America had produced. Surely creatures this large and imposing must have been the ultimate apex predators, the final word in avian carnivory. But once again, appearances proved to be deceiving. Detailed anatomical analysis reveals that these Australian giants had also abandoned the predatory lifestyle in favor of herbivory. Their claws were more like hooves than talons, perfectly adapted for walking across varied terrain, but useless for grasping and killing prey. Their beaks, while impressively large, lacked the sharp, predatory points that characterize true carnivores. Everything about their anatomy tells the story of creatures adapted for browsing on vegetation rather than hunting other animals. They were essentially gigantic, flightless geese, perfectly evolved for exploiting Australia's unique plant communities, but completely unsuited for a predatory lifestyle. This pattern of convergent evolution toward giant herbivorous birds on multiple continents raises absolutely fascinating questions about the ecological pressures and opportunities that existed during the Cenozoic era. It seems that in many parts of the world, the post-extinction environment strongly favored the evolution of large ground-dwelling birds, but only in South America did these birds maintain their commitment to carnivory. What made South America so different? Why did terror birds remain dedicated predators while their superficially similar counterparts elsewhere became gentle giants? The answer lies in the unique ecological circumstances that shaped the South American continent during this crucial period in Earth's history. South America's geographic isolation created a perfect storm of conditions that not only allowed terror birds to thrive as predators, but actually required them to maintain their carnivorous lifestyle. The mammalian fauna of South America was so bizarre and so fundamentally different from anywhere else on Earth that conventional ecological relationships simply didn't apply. The prey animals available to South American terror birds were unlike anything found on other continents. There were massive, heavily armored creatures that required specialized techniques to bring down, swift, agile mammals that demanded incredible speed and precision to catch, bizarre evolutionary experiments that challenged every assumption about how predator-prey relationships should work. This constant pressure to innovate and adapt kept terror birds evolutionarily sharp in a way that their counterparts on other continents never experienced. While birds elsewhere could settle into comfortable herbivorous niches, South American terror birds were engaged in an ongoing evolutionary arms race that demanded constant improvement and refinement of their predatory abilities. The result was a lineage of birds that pushed the boundaries of avian carnivory far beyond what anyone thought possible. They developed hunting strategies, anatomical adaptations, and behavioral innovations that were completely unique in the bird world. They became living proof that birds, given the right circumstances and sufficient evolutionary pressure, could reclaim their dinosaurian heritage as supreme terrestrial predators. But this story of convergent evolution toward giant birds on multiple continents also highlights something else that's absolutely crucial to understanding the terror bird saga. The ecological niches that large flightless birds were filling during the Cenozoic weren't random accidents. They represented fundamental opportunities in post-extinction ecosystems that needed to be exploited by something. On most continents, mammals quickly stepped up to fill the roles left vacant by extinct dinosaurs. But in isolated regions with unique ecological circumstances, birds found ways to exploit these opportunities instead. The fact that this happened independently on multiple continents suggests that giant flightless birds represented a genuinely viable evolutionary strategy for exploiting certain types of ecological niches. The difference was that only in South America did the specific combination of factors exist that favored carnivorous rather than herbivorous giants. The unique prey base, the absence of competing mammalian predators, and the particular environmental conditions all combined to create a situation where predatory birds could not only survive, but absolutely dominate their ecosystems. This makes the eventual extinction of terror birds even more tragic from an evolutionary perspective. They weren't failed experiments or evolutionary dead ends. They were highly successful solutions to genuine ecological challenges, solutions that worked brilliantly for millions of years. Their extinction represents the loss of a completely unique approach to terrestrial predation that will never be replicated. Meanwhile, as paleontologists were grappling with the reality that most giant Cenozoic birds were actually herbivores, the true scope of terror bird diversity was becoming clearer. The South American fossil record was revealing an incredible array of species, each adapted for specific ecological roles and hunting strategies. This wasn't just a single group of similar predators. This was an entire adaptive radiation of carnivorous specialists. Some terror birds had evolved for pursuit hunting across open grasslands, developing incredibly long legs and streamlined bodies that could sustain high speeds over long distances. Others were built for ambush predation in forested environments, with more robust builds and explosive acceleration capabilities. Still others seemed to be experimenting with entirely novel approaches to avian carnivory. The diversity of hunting strategies represented by different terror bird species was truly remarkable. Some were probably solitary hunters, relying on stealth and individual skill to bring down prey. Others may have been pack hunters, using sophisticated cooperative strategies to tackle prey that would have been impossible for a single individual to handle. Evidence suggests that some species were specialized for hunting particular types of prey. Certain terror birds seem to have been perfectly adapted for taking down the large, slow-moving ground sloths that were common in South America during their heyday. Others appear to have specialized in hunting the swift, agile mammals that shared their grassland habitats. The anatomical variations among different terror bird species reflect this incredible diversity of ecological roles. Some had relatively gracile builds optimized for speed and agility. Others were massively robust, built for delivering overwhelming force to large, dangerous prey. Still others showed intermediate characteristics that suggest they were ecological generalists, capable of adapting their hunting strategies to whatever opportunities presented themselves. This level of ecological specialization within a single lineage is actually quite rare in the fossil record. Most groups of related predators tend to be relatively similar in their basic approach to hunting, with only minor variations in size or specific adaptations. The terror birds were different. They had managed to diversify into virtually every conceivable predatory niche available in their ecosystem. Part of what made this diversification possible was the sheer length of time that terror birds had to evolve in isolation. 20+ million years is an enormous span of time from an evolutionary perspective, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of generations for most bird species. That's more than enough time for a single ancestral lineage to split into dozens of specialized forms, each perfectly adapted to exploit specific opportunities in their environment. But time alone wasn't sufficient to explain the remarkable diversity of terror bird forms. The key factor was the incredible variety of ecological opportunities available in South America during the Cenozoic. The continent was home to an absolutely bizarre assemblage of prey animals, each presenting different challenges and requiring different hunting strategies to exploit successfully. There were massive, heavily armored creatures that required brute force and specialized techniques to penetrate their defenses. There were swift, agile animals that could only be caught through superior speed and precision. There were arboreal species that spent most of their time in trees, semi-aquatic forms that lived in and around water, and burrowing animals that had to be dug out of underground retreats. Each of these different prey types represented a potential ecological niche for a specialized terror bird predator. Over millions of years, different terror bird lineages evolved the specific adaptations needed to exploit these opportunities. The result was an incredible diversity of forms, each representing a different solution to the fundamental challenge of making a living as an avian carnivore. This process of adaptive radiation was facilitated by South America's continued isolation from other continents. Without competition from mammalian predators, terror birds were free to experiment with hunting strategies and anatomical adaptations that might not have been viable in more competitive environments. They could afford to be highly specialized because they didn't have to worry about being outcompeted by more generalized predators. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of evolutionary experiments in avian predation. There were terror birds with incredibly elongated legs for pursuit hunting, others with massively reinforced skulls for delivering crushing blows, and still others with specialized beak shapes for particular types of prey handling. Each represented a different approach to the fundamental challenge of being a successful predator. Some of the most intriguing fossils show evidence of terror birds that seem to have been experimenting with entirely novel hunting strategies. There are specimens with unusual claw configurations that might have been adapted for climbing or grasping prey in ways that no modern bird attempts. Others show skull modifications that suggest they were developing new techniques for processing prey or accessing food sources that other predators couldn't exploit. This period of experimentation and diversification represents one of the most remarkable episodes in the entire history of avian evolution. Never before or since have birds achieved such a level of success as terrestrial predators. The terror birds weren't just filling ecological niches left vacant by extinct dinosaurs. They were creating entirely new approaches to predation that had never been attempted by any vertebrate group. The success of this adaptive radiation was so complete that terror birds essentially replaced mammalian predators entirely throughout much of South America. While other continents were seeing the rise of early cats, dogs, bears, and other carnivorous mammals, South America remained firmly under avian control. This created one of the most unique predator-prey dynamics in the entire history of life on Earth. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of terror bird evolution during this period was how it demonstrated the incredible potential that still existed within the avian lineage. Birds are often thought of as being constrained by their evolutionary heritage, limited by adaptations for flight that prevent them from achieving the size and power of mammalian predators. The terror birds proved that this assumption was completely wrong. Given the right circumstances and sufficient evolutionary time, birds could match or exceed anything that mammals had achieved in terms of predatory prowess. They could grow to enormous sizes, develop devastating weapons, and create sophisticated hunting strategies that rivaled those of any other vertebrate group. The terror birds were living proof that the age of dinosaurs had never really ended. It had simply taken on a new form. This realization has profound implications for how we think about evolution and the potential for different lineages to achieve success in various ecological roles. The terror bird showed that there's nothing inherently superior about mammalian approaches to predation. Birds, given the right opportunities, could be every bit as successful as apex predators. The diversity and success of terror birds during their heyday also highlights the importance of geographic isolation in driving evolutionary innovation. South America's separation from other continents didn't just allow terror birds to survive. It allowed them to flourish and diversify in ways that would have been impossible in a more connected world. Isolation provided the freedom to experiment. That resulted in some of the most remarkable predators in Earth's history. But, as we'll see, this same isolation that had been such a crucial factor in terror bird success would eventually become a liability. The world was changing, continents were moving, and the geographic barriers that had protected and nurtured terror bird evolution for so many millions of years were about to disappear. When that happened, the terror birds would face challenges unlike anything they had encountered during their long evolutionary journey. The stage was being set for the next great chapter in the terror bird saga, one that would test every adaptation they had developed during their millions of years of South American dominance. The question was whether these magnificent predators, so perfectly evolved for their isolated world, would be able to adapt to a rapidly changing planet where their splendid isolation was coming to an end. The answer would determine whether the terror birds would continue their remarkable evolutionary success story or become another entry in the long catalog of extinction events that punctuate the history of life on Earth. But before we get to that climactic chapter, we need to understand just how far these incredible birds managed to spread their influence beyond their South American homeland, and what happened when they finally encountered the wider world that had been evolving in parallel to their own remarkable journey. The terror birds weren't content to remain forever confined to their South American fortress. As the epochs rolled by and the very continents themselves began their slow dance of geological transformation, these magnificent predators would embark on one of the most audacious expansions in the entire history of vertebrate evolution. What happened next would test every single adaptation they had refined during their millions of years of unchallenged dominance. But before we dive head first into their great migration, we need to pause and consider something absolutely crucial that's been building in the background of our entire story. The terror birds weren't operating in a vacuum during their South American Golden Age. While they were busy perfecting their deadly craft in splendid isolation, the rest of the world was conducting its own evolutionary experiments with giant predatory birds. Picture this absolutely mind-blowing scenario playing out simultaneously across multiple continents. While South American terror birds were reaching the pinnacle of avian carnivory, similar evolutionary pressures were creating what appeared to be equally terrifying monsters in completely different parts of the world. It's as if nature was running a massive controlled experiment, testing whether birds could successfully reclaim their dinosaurian legacy as apex predators on a truly global scale. The results of this worldwide experiment would prove to be both absolutely fascinating and deeply ironically disappointing for anyone hoping for maximum prehistoric carnage. Because here's the thing that nobody saw coming, and it completely changes how we understand the uniqueness of what terror birds accomplished in South America. In Europe, Asia, and North America, a group of absolutely colossal birds called gastornithids were writing their own chapter in the book of post-extinction predatory dominance. These creatures were genuinely massive, with some species towering nearly 7 feet tall and tipping the scales at close to 400 pounds. They possessed what appeared to be the perfect template for apex predation: enormous, crushing beaks, incredibly powerful legs, and a completely terrestrial lifestyle that had abandoned flight for ground-based supremacy. The most famous of these northern giants dominated the landscape from the late Paleocene through the Eocene epochs. This formidable creature stalked the ancient forests and grasslands of what would eventually become modern Europe and North America, its massive silhouette casting ominous shadows that should have sent every mammal in the vicinity scrambling for the nearest hiding place. For decades, paleontologists looked at these fossils and saw exactly what you'd expect to see. Here were the northern equivalents of South American terror birds, proof that the same evolutionary pressures that had created apex avian predators in South America were operating on a global scale. The anatomy seemed absolutely perfect for a carnivorous lifestyle. Those massive skulls could house brains sophisticated enough for complex hunting strategies. Those enormous beaks appeared perfectly engineered for crushing bones and tearing flesh from struggling prey. But science has this absolutely maddening habit of completely overturning our most dramatic and exciting assumptions, and the gastornithids would prove to be one of paleontology's most crushing disappointments. Advanced biomechanical analysis, detailed examination of their skeletal structure, and careful study of their anatomical features has revealed something that completely demolishes our understanding of these apparent killing machines. These fearsome-looking giants, despite their absolutely intimidating appearance and perfect predatory build, were actually gentle herbivores. Yes, you heard that correctly. These massive, terrifying birds with their enormous beaks and powerful frames were essentially prehistoric vegetarians, using their impressive anatomical equipment not to crush the skulls of helpless mammals, but to crack open tough fruits, nuts, and fibrous plant materials. It's like discovering that the scariest-looking bouncer at your local establishment actually spends his free time volunteering at animal shelters and writing poetry about wildflowers. The cognitive dissonance is absolutely staggering, and it completely reframes everything we thought we knew about giant predatory birds during the Cenozoic era. The evidence for this herbivorous lifestyle becomes absolutely compelling once you know what to look for and abandon your preconceptions about what these creatures should have been doing. The shape of their beaks, while undeniably massive and impressive, lacks the sharp, pointed characteristics we see in dedicated carnivores. Instead, they're broader and more robust, perfectly engineered for applying tremendous crushing force to hard plant materials rather than slicing through flesh and bone. Their leg bones, while certainly powerful enough to support their massive frames, don't show the same adaptations for delivering precise, devastating kicks that we see in genuine terror birds. The muscle attachment sites, the joint configurations, the overall biomechanical setup, everything points toward creatures built for walking and foraging rather than pursuit, hunting, and combat. Even more telling is the microscopic analysis of wear patterns on their beaks and the configuration of their jaw muscles, which reveals adaptations perfectly suited for processing tough, fibrous plant material rather than tearing apart animal tissues. These weren't killing machines at all. They were essentially gigantic feathered landscaping crews perfectly adapted for exploiting the abundant plant resources of their warm, humid, prehistoric world. This revelation puts the South American terror birds in an even more spectacular and unique light. While their northern cousins were apparently content to embrace a peaceful, herbivorous existence, munching their way through prehistoric salad bars, the terror birds remained absolutely committed to their carnivorous calling. They were the genuine article, the real deal, the authentic inheritors of the predatory legacy left completely vacant by the extinction of non-avian dinosaurs. But the gastornithids weren't the only case of mistaken identity in the giant prehistoric bird world. Down in Australia, an even more impressive group of creatures was making its own evolutionary statement about what birds could accomplish when freed from the constraints of flight. These beasts, nicknamed the demon ducks by researchers with an obvious flair for dramatic terminology, were pushing the boundaries of avian size to truly astronomical proportions. Some of these Australian giants reached weights of over 1,800 pounds, making them among the largest birds ever to walk the earth. Only the legendary elephant birds of Madagascar could claim to be significantly larger. The sheer physical presence of these creatures would have been absolutely overwhelming to witness. Picture something roughly the size of a compact car, covered in feathers, moving with the fluid grace that only birds can achieve, and you'll start to get an idea of what these monsters looked like in life. At first glance, these demon ducks seemed like they would make even the largest terror birds look like harmless backyard songbirds by comparison. Their massive size suggested predatory capabilities that would completely dwarf anything South America had produced during its millions of years of avian experimentation. Surely creatures this large and imposing must have been the ultimate expression of apex predation, the final word in evolutionary carnivory. But once again, appearances proved to be absolutely deceiving in the most frustrating way possible. Detailed anatomical analysis reveals that these Australian giants had also completely abandoned the predatory lifestyle in favor of peaceful herbivory. Their claws were more like hooves than the razor-sharp talons you'd expect from predators, perfectly adapted for walking across varied terrain, but completely useless for grasping and subduing struggling prey. Their beaks, while impressively large and certainly intimidating to look at, lacked the sharp predatory points and cutting edges that characterize true carnivores. Instead, they were broad, robust structures perfectly engineered for processing tough plant materials. Everything about their anatomy tells the story of creatures superbly adapted for browsing on vegetation rather than hunting other animals. They were essentially gigantic flightless geese, perfectly evolved for exploiting Australia's unique plant communities, but completely unsuited for a predatory lifestyle. Another case of evolution producing something that looked absolutely terrifying, but was actually as gentle as a prehistoric lamb. This pattern of convergent evolution toward giant herbivorous birds on multiple continents raises absolutely fascinating questions about the ecological pressures and opportunities that existed during the Cenozoic era. It seems that in many parts of the world, the post-extinction environment strongly favored the evolution of large, ground-dwelling birds. But only in South America did these birds maintain their commitment to carnivory and develop into true apex predators. What made South America so fundamentally different from everywhere else? Why did terror birds remain dedicated carnivorous killers while their superficially similar counterparts on other continents became gentle giants, content to munch on prehistoric vegetation? The answer lies in the absolutely unique ecological circumstances that shaped the South American continent during this crucial period in Earth's evolutionary history. South America's geographic isolation created a perfect storm of conditions that not only allowed terror birds to thrive as predators, but actually required them to maintain and continuously refine their carnivorous lifestyle. The mammalian fauna of South America was so bizarre, so fundamentally different from anywhere else on Earth, that conventional ecological relationships and predatory strategies simply wouldn't work. The prey animals available to South American terror birds were unlike anything found on other continents. There were massive, heavily armored creatures that required specialized techniques and incredible force to bring down. Swift, agile mammals that demanded lightning-fast reflexes and perfect precision to catch. Bizarre evolutionary experiments that challenged every assumption about how predator-prey relationships should function in a balanced ecosystem. This constant, relentless pressure to innovate and adapt kept terror birds evolutionarily sharp in a way that their counterparts on other continents never experienced. While birds elsewhere could settle comfortably into herbivorous niches that required relatively little specialized adaptation, South American terror birds were engaged in an ongoing evolutionary arms race that demanded constant improvement and refinement of their predatory abilities. The result was a lineage of birds that pushed the boundaries of avian carnivory far beyond what anyone had thought possible. They developed hunting strategies, anatomical adaptations, and behavioral innovations that were completely unique in the entire bird world. They became living proof that birds, given the right circumstances and sufficient evolutionary pressure, could not only reclaim their dinosaurian heritage, but actually exceed what their ancient ancestors had accomplished as terrestrial predators. Meanwhile, as the true scope of terror bird uniqueness was becoming clear, these remarkable predators were preparing for their most ambitious undertaking yet. The geological forces that had kept South America isolated for tens of millions of years were slowly but inexorably working to reconnect the continent with the wider world. Volcanic activity was beginning to build what would eventually become the Isthmus of Panama, creating the first tentative connections between North and South America in geological ages. This process would take millions of years to complete, but its effects would be felt long before the continents were fully connected. As the gap between North and South America gradually narrowed, occasional island chains and temporary land bridges began to appear, creating stepping stones that would allow the most adventurous species to make the journey between continents. For the terror birds, this represented both an incredible opportunity and a potentially existential challenge. On one hand, the opening of new territories offered the chance to expand their range far beyond the borders of their South American homeland and establish populations in completely new ecosystems with different prey bases and environmental conditions. But the connection also meant that South America's unique, isolated ecosystem would be exposed to competition from North American species for the first time in tens of millions of years. Cats, dogs, bears, and other mammalian carnivores that had been perfecting their own hunting techniques in the highly competitive environment of North America were about to encounter the isolated world of South American terror birds. The first terror birds to make the northward journey were like evolutionary ambassadors, carrying with them millions of years of South American innovation in avian predation. These pioneering individuals had to adapt quickly to completely unfamiliar environments, new prey species they had never encountered, and competitive pressures that hadn't existed in their isolated homeland for geological ages. The fact that they not only survived this transition, but actually succeeded in establishing thriving populations is a testament to the fundamental soundness of the terror bird evolutionary design. These weren't desperate refugees fleeing a failing ecosystem. These were confident predators at the peak of their evolutionary game, testing their abilities against new challenges and exploring new opportunities for expansion. One of the most successful of these northern pioneers managed to establish robust, thriving populations across a huge swath of what is now the southern United States. Fossil evidence shows that these birds successfully colonized territories stretching from the Gulf Coast of Texas all the way to the Atlantic shores of Florida, adapting to everything from coastal wetlands to inland prairies and forest edges. What's particularly remarkable about this northern expansion is that it occurred while terror birds were still at the absolute height of their success back in South America. This wasn't a desperate migration by a lineage in decline. This was a confident expansion by creatures that had mastered their craft so thoroughly that they were ready to take on entirely new worlds. The terror birds that made this epic journey had to demonstrate incredible adaptability and evolutionary flexibility. The climate in North America was substantially different from what they were accustomed to in their tropical South American homeland. The prey animals were completely unfamiliar, representing evolutionary lineages that had developed in isolation from anything the terror birds had encountered. The vegetation was strange. The seasonal patterns were unlike anything in their ancestral memory, and the competitive landscape included predators they had never faced before. Yet, not only did they survive this transition, but they actually thrived, establishing populations that would persist for millions of years and leave their mark on North American ecosystems in ways that are still detectable in the fossil record today. Some researchers believe these northern terror bird populations may have even developed their own unique adaptations and hunting strategies, diverging from their South American ancestors in response to the different challenges and opportunities they encountered. But success in North America came with its own set of unprecedented challenges. For the first time in their evolutionary history, terror birds were no longer the undisputed apex predators in their ecosystem. They now had to share their ecological niche with mammalian carnivores that were every bit as sophisticated, deadly, and evolutionarily refined as they were. The fossil record from this period tells an absolutely fascinating story of coexistence rather than immediate competitive exclusion. Rather than one group immediately driving the other to extinction, terror birds and mammalian predators seem to have carved out complementary ecological niches, each exploiting slightly different aspects of the same general ecosystem. This suggests a level of ecological sophistication that goes far beyond simple brute force competition. Both terror birds and mammalian predators were apparently capable of adapting their hunting strategies and prey preferences to avoid direct competition, creating a more complex and diverse predatory landscape than either group could have maintained alone. Some terror birds may have specialized in hunting prey that was particularly difficult for mammalian predators to catch or subdue. Their incredible running speed and unique anatomical adaptations may have given them access to prey species that four-legged predators couldn't effectively pursue. Others might have focused on scavenging opportunities that their mammalian competitors couldn't exploit as efficiently. The ability of terror birds to not just survive but actually flourish in this competitive environment speaks volumes about their evolutionary sophistication and adaptability. These weren't primitive throwbacks struggling to compete with more advanced mammals. These were highly evolved predators demonstrating that they could hold their own against some of the most successful carnivores in Earth's history. This period of coexistence also reveals something crucial about the nature of ecological competition that challenges many of our assumptions about how evolution works. Rather than being a zero-sum game where one group inevitably displaces another, ecological competition can actually drive innovation and specialization that benefits entire ecosystems. The presence of both terror birds and mammalian predators in the same ecosystems may have created a more stable and resilient predatory network than either group could have maintained alone. Different predators with different hunting strategies and prey preferences can create a more balanced ecosystem that's less vulnerable to disruption and more capable of supporting diverse prey communities. Meanwhile, back in their South American homeland, the terror bird stronghold was experiencing its own dramatic transformation as the great American biotic interchange began to accelerate. The arrival of North American mammals was reshaping ecosystems that had remained essentially unchanged for millions of years, creating both new challenges and unexpected opportunities for the various terror bird species. Some terror bird lineages found themselves facing direct competition from incoming mammalian predators for the first time in their evolutionary history. Others discovered new ecological niches created by the disruption of established relationships between native South American species. Still others found ways to exploit the newcomers themselves, either as prey species or as competitors that could be outmaneuvered through superior knowledge of local conditions. The result was a period of incredible evolutionary experimentation and rapid adaptation. Some terror bird species doubled down on their traditional strategies, becoming even more specialized and efficient at what they had always done best. Others embraced change, developing new hunting techniques and exploring previously unexploited ecological opportunities created by the arrival of foreign species. This period of upheaval also witnessed the emergence of some of the largest and most impressive terror birds in the entire lineage's history. As if responding directly to the challenge posed by incoming mammalian competitors, some species pushed the boundaries of size and power even further than their ancestors had, becoming truly colossal predators that dwarfed anything that had come before. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of evolutionary experiments, each more remarkable and impressive than the last. There were terror birds adapted for high-speed pursuit hunting across open plains, others built for ambush predation in dense forest environments, and still others that seemed to be testing entirely novel approaches to avian carnivory that had never been attempted before. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this period is what it reveals about the fundamental nature of terror bird evolution and adaptability. Rather than being rigid specialists locked into unchanging patterns of behavior and anatomy, these creatures demonstrated remarkable flexibility and evolutionary creativity. They were evolutionary generalists in the very best sense of the term, capable of rapid adaptation to changing circumstances while maintaining their core identity as apex avian predators. This adaptability would prove absolutely crucial as the world continued to change around them at an accelerating pace. The Great American Biotic Interchange was just the beginning of a series of environmental challenges that would test every aspect of terror bird biology, behavior, and evolutionary fitness. Climate patterns were shifting dramatically, sea levels were fluctuating, and the entire planet was beginning its transition toward the cooler, more variable conditions that would characterize the later Cenozoic era. The terror birds had already survived the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs, thrived during the warm greenhouse conditions of the early Cenozoic, adapted to the changing geography of their homeland, and successfully expanded into entirely new continents. They had proven themselves to be one of the most successful and adaptable lineages in the entire history of life on Earth, capable of meeting and overcoming challenges that had defeated countless other species. But their greatest test was yet to come. The very climate system that had allowed them to flourish for so many millions of years was about to undergo changes so fundamental and far-reaching that they would challenge every aspect of the terror bird evolutionary strategy. The warm, stable conditions that had characterized much of the Cenozoic were giving way to a new era of cooling temperatures, shifting precipitation patterns, and increasing environmental instability. How would these magnificent predators, so perfectly adapted to their warm tropical world, respond to a planet that was becoming progressively cooler, drier, and more unpredictable? Would their remarkable adaptability and evolutionary flexibility be sufficient to carry them through this ultimate challenge? Or would they join the countless other lineages that had risen to evolutionary greatness only to fall victim to circumstances beyond their control? The answer to that question would determine whether the terror birds would continue their remarkable evolutionary journey into the modern era, or become another chapter in the long, tragic history of extinction that punctuates the story of life on Earth. But before we explore that climactic final act, we need to understand the full scope of what these incredible creatures had accomplished during their reign as the world's most successful avian predators. The terror birds weren't just another group of large prehistoric animals that happened to go extinct. They represented something far more significant, a complete reimagining of what birds could accomplish when freed from the constraints that typically limit avian evolution. They were living proof that the age of dinosaurs had never truly ended, but had simply taken on new forms and found new ways to dominate terrestrial ecosystems. Their success wasn't just measured in their impressive size or fearsome appearance. It was demonstrated by their incredible diversity, their sophisticated hunting strategies, their ability to adapt to changing conditions, and their capacity to maintain their dominance for over 20 million years. They had created an entirely new model for avian evolution that challenged every assumption about what birds could accomplish as terrestrial predators. But even more importantly, they had shown that evolution is capable of producing solutions to ecological challenges that we would never have imagined possible. The terror birds represented a pathway that vertebrate evolution had never explored before and has never attempted since. They were unique in the truest sense of the word, irreplaceable experiments in the grand laboratory of natural selection. And that's what makes their eventual fate so profoundly tragic. These weren't failed experiments or evolutionary dead ends. They were magnificent successes that had earned their place at the top of their ecosystems through millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Their loss represents not just the extinction of individual species, but the disappearance of an entire approach to terrestrial predation that will never be seen again. The final chapters of the terror bird story would prove that even the most successful evolutionary strategies are ultimately temporary, subject to forces and changes that no amount of adaptation can overcome. But before we reach that conclusion, we need to appreciate the full magnitude of what these incredible creatures accomplished during their time in the spotlight of evolutionary history. They had rewritten the rules of what it meant to be a predatory bird, and in doing so, they had created one of the most spectacular chapters in the entire story of life on Earth. The story of terror bird extinction is one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the entire chronicle of evolutionary history, made all the more tragic by how close these magnificent creatures came to surviving into the modern world. But to understand why they ultimately failed, we need to examine the most persistent and seemingly logical explanation that has dominated scientific thinking for decades. For generations, paleontologists believed they had cracked the code of terror bird extinction with what seemed like the perfect evolutionary narrative. It was a classic tale of ecological warfare, the kind of dramatic story that fits perfectly with our understanding of natural selection and competitive exclusion. According to this theory, the terror birds were doomed the moment North and South America became fully connected through the formation of the Isthmus of Panama. Picture the scene as scientists imagined it for so many years. Around 3 million years ago, that final land bridge snapped into place, unleashing what amounted to a biological invasion of unprecedented scale. Sophisticated mammalian predators that had been honing their skills in the competitive crucible of North America suddenly gained access to the isolated ecosystems of South America, where terror birds had reigned supreme for over 20 million years. The theory painted a vivid picture of evolutionary inevitability. These incoming mammals, cats with their stealth and precision, dogs with their pack-hunting strategies, Bears, with their raw power, represented the cutting edge of predatory evolution. They had been tested and refined through millions of years of intense competition with other advanced carnivores. In contrast, the terror birds were portrayed as evolutionary relics, magnificent perhaps, but ultimately outdated throwbacks to an earlier age. According to this narrative, the outcome was never really in doubt. The mammalian invaders would systematically outcompete the terror birds for prey resources, gradually pushing them out of their ecological niches until the last of these ancient predators finally succumbed to superior competition. It was evolution in action, the inevitable triumph of more advanced life forms over primitive predecessors. This explanation had everything going for it from a scientific storytelling perspective. It was elegant, logical, and fit perfectly with our broader understanding of how evolution works. More sophisticated predators replacing less sophisticated ones? That's exactly what we'd expect to see in nature. The timing seemed perfect, too. Mammalian diversification in South America coinciding with terror bird decline. What more evidence could you possibly need? But here's the problem with theories that seem too perfect, too neat, too satisfying from a narrative perspective. They're often completely wrong, and the competitive exclusion theory for terror bird extinction falls apart the moment you start examining what the fossils actually tell us, rather than what we think they should tell us. Let's start with the most glaring issue. If mammalian predators were systematically driving terror birds to extinction through superior competitive ability, we should see clear, unambiguous evidence of this process in the fossil record. We should find geological layers showing terror bird disappearing at precisely the same time that mammalian carnivores appear in significant numbers. We should see evidence of declining terror bird populations, shrinking geographic ranges, or signs of ecological stress coinciding with increasing mammalian diversity. But that's not what the fossils show us at all. Instead of evidence for intense competition and systematic displacement, we find something far more surprising and, frankly, more interesting. From an ecological perspective, terror birds and mammalian predators weren't locked in some epic battle for evolutionary supremacy. They were coexisting quite successfully, often in the same geographic regions, and sometimes for millions of years at a time. Take the most compelling example from North America, where one of the most successful terror bird species managed to establish thriving populations across an enormous geographic range. This remarkable predator colonized territories stretching from the Gulf Coast all the way to the Atlantic seaboard, creating stable populations that persisted for millions of years. And here's the kicker. Those exact same regions were simultaneously home to diverse communities of mammalian predators, including some of the most formidable carnivores of their era. If the competition theory were accurate, we should see evidence of intense ecological pressure, declining population sizes, or clear signs that one group was systematically displacing the other. Instead, we see the complete opposite. Both terror birds and mammalian predators appear to have been flourishing simultaneously, each apparently finding ways to exploit the available resources without driving their competitors to extinction. This pattern of successful coexistence appears repeatedly throughout the fossil record, in location after location and time period after time period. Rather than evidence for competitive exclusion, we find testimony to something far more sophisticated, ecological partitioning that allowed multiple types of apex predators to thrive in the same general environment. The key to understanding this coexistence lies in recognizing that ecosystems are far more complex than simple competitive arenas, where the strongest automatically wins. Different predators can exploit different aspects of the same environment